Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game battle report. In this game we're playing vanilla Haqqislam versus Tunguska, and we're doing so in a custom scenario. The scenario is called Deep Analysis, and it's been written by one of my locals, and we are testing it on the fly, but it's also being a potential for me to try out some things I wouldn't normally use in a Haqqislam list. This is something that you can do if you set yourself little challenges, you try and do things deliberately differently, or if you play custom kind of different scenarios. It can prompt creativity, and this was kind of an example of that. So I wanted to talk about the game. Firstly, let's talk about the scenario. So this is the first draft setup for Deep Analysis. Actually, the scenario is in like its second or third version now. Local player Rob has been slowly iterating on it. That's other Rob, not myself. Within like 5 minutes of sitting down, we had both unanimously agreed, stuff the 8-inch deployment zones. We hate them, they suck. So imagine this, but with 12-inch deployment zones. There are 4 consoles, and each console has a zone of operations. And the goal of the objective is to place multi-scanners in those zone of operations. Any specialist can place a multi-scanner by hitting a whip roll, provided you have not already placed 8 scanners that game. And chain of command and engineer models get a bonus. You scan a zone of operations if you have a multi-scanner, mostly within the zone of operations, at the end of your turn, and multi-scanners persist but are destructible. They have no armor, no BTS, cannot gain structure, but they do have 2 points of, cannot gain cover, but they do have 2 points of structure. So the tempo of the scenario is very, very heavily scenario-oriented. You need to get these multi-scanners down. If your opponent has them down, you kind of want to destroy them. And the game generally revolves around this scenario and counter-scenario play in a way that really is reminiscent more of like Infinity almost before I began playing. There are kind of like old days stories of the Wild West of N3 when merely having a thermoptic camouflage infiltrating specialist to press a button as the very last order of the very last turn of the game was this sort of like degenerate first order optimal play that you had to bring, specialists and sensors to deal with. But it was a great time in the sense that the game was very much not about annihilating your opponent primarily, but was about aggressively playing the scenario. And Infinity has moved back and forth between those two extremes intentionally as part of the scenario design pack. Corvus Belli and Heloise in particular are on record as saying that the purpose of scenarios is to make the meta vary itself, so you will see intentional swings back and forth. But for a lot of the time I've been playing, it has been kind of permissible in a lot, not all, but a lot of scenarios, to step on your opponent's neck as a primary mission goal. This is not that. This is a scenario where conflict is necessary because you are pursuing the scenario, but you are pursuing the scenario. That engineer and chain of command bonus is also interesting, and it let me build for the mission in an interesting way. So here's my list. So there are a few things that are going on here, some of which are fairly straightforward, but if you are a Haqqislam player, as soon as you heard me say chain of command bonus, you'll have immediately gone, Farzan chain of command. And sure enough, that's kind of where my list started. I would not normally actually ever take the Farzan chain of command. I don't particularly like paying 28 points just for chain of command. It is a totally serviceable midfield specialist, but it occupies kind of a valuable slot. It's kind of vulnerable. I actually, if at all possible, I will almost never take chain of command except in Toha, where I have to unlock more symbiomates. If I've got it for free or as part of my baked-in list construction, it will change how I build my lists. But in just about every list, even vanilla hack, I would almost always, I'll just keep my lieutenant alive. And if it dies, that's on me. But someone like Saladin can protect themselves with their own strategos and just by being passive and hiding and fueling the rest of the army. But if I'm taking a Farzan, I can do something different. Now, the kind of sort of classic lieutenant, if you've got a Farzan, in fact, the classic lieutenant in many situations is actually an Asawira AP Spitfire lieutenant, which is quite a good piece, but I am not personally in love with. What I wanted to try, and something that's been on my mind for a little while, is this Boktar profile. So this is the Boktar FTO, that's non-parachutist, paramedic lieutenant tack-aware with viral rifle, light shotgun, and decharges. And this is a piece that I have kind of been thinking about since having a look, for example, like some of my games, in particular some of my Toha games at CanCon, where I had that wonderful lieutenant with 2 extra orders, which is just so good in Toha, but then also seeing like other active lieutenants. Maruts with tack-aware and their lieutenant order, admittedly strategos. Makayon, for example, with his lieutenant order. CanCon saw a lot of lists just kind of like edge that lieutenant order into usefulness, And if you can do that, that's an extra resource. If you can use it, it's super useful. Like, for some lists, it's very, very easy. You play nomads and you can take a gator. Cool, you've just made your turn order useful. But it's not as easy for every faction. And this was interesting because 2 orders on a model like a Boktar I felt could potentially do something. I didn't want to take the non-specialist Red Fury profile because it's kind of just a Mukhtar with extra steps. But the Viral Rifle FTO Paramedic has a bunch of unique things going for it. It was very experimental, but I ended up being quite happy with how it progressed. Otherwise, the list is a bit of a return to some old forms with 3 Armies. There's also a Libertos in there, so combined with the Farzan, you have a ton of very cheap, I mean the Farzan is expensive, but the rest of the midfield is cheap as chips. There is also a consistent number of camouflage markers in both groups. Each of those 2 combat groups presents 2 Mimetism 0 and 1 Mimetism 3 camouflage markers, which actually discombobulated my opponent a little bit and presents some interesting options. The Monstriker is there purely because I wanted the engineer bonus, and it's a cheaper regular engineer to go forward and lay scanners in this scenario. But since I was taking one, I took a Shakush as well. Shakush is a piece I've wanted to try out again for some time. I used one very early in M3, but that was in 4 rather, but that was a totally different environment. Back, like, I think the first time I used the Shakush was when its N4 profile had been spoiled in M3. And then I was like, well, that's just ridiculous value. But now it's like, yeah, is it though? Is that actually that good? Like, it's more expensive than Trip Hammer. Wanted to try it out, and that also leads into a sub-theme the list has, which is to have just a ton of tack-aware. With the Rafiq, Druid with the Mukhtar, or the Shakush, there are 3 tack-aware pieces in this list. And then it was 2 Barid KHDs, because I knew my opponent was playing Tunguska, and screw them, and just a single Comrade. So some things that are missing from this list, and while I'm being spicy, a bad Fidei profile with the boarding shotgun. I find I shotgun with Fideis a lot, so let's try that out. Is it worth having the +1 damage? So some things that are obviously missing from this list. My usual Haqqislam firepower staples. No Azrael, no Nauf, no Asawira Doctor, which is something that I like to take, and no Zalekia, and no Zamira. Just the Kum Rider. No Mutawiya, like you have to make some sacrifices. This list does. The irregulars are all just Delami basically and 1 biker. There are some things I will not run from this list. Again, spoiler alert, one of them is the Shakush. That's going to have to take some time before it goes into a list again. But there are some pieces here that were really cool, and going back to that old Delami defense, at least in this matchup, was super effective. Let's have a look at the table. I'm not going to talk about my opponent Rob's list, because I cannot fully reconstruct it, but you'll see it in deployment, and it was almost entirely formed around a single Uber link. So here's our table for this scenario, and I am going first. I win the roll, I snap pick first, because I think in this scenario there is no particular reason to go second. Scoring happens when you play. Basically, if you have a multi-scanner in play at the end of one of your turns, you will score for the round. So there's not a special need to go second. One of the things about the scenario that's kind of nice is that if you're going first, you will still be incentivized to do a bunch of scenario stuff. And because you're trying to do a bunch of scenario stuff, you aren't just alphaing your opponent into the ground. So it is not a bad scenario to go second. You just don't need to. This picture was actually taken after the first Impetuous activation, which is why there is a Kum Rider here. But we'll go through my deployment. So the Fidei is the reserve, and otherwise everything kind of goes down in a relatively straightforward way. We are playing these buildings with interiors and rooftops, with the idea being that you can remove a rooftop. So there are some things inside interiors. But from left to right, we have a Fanus remote here. One of my 2 Barid killer hackers here with the other one here. The Shakush here in the building, we've ruled that these are wide access points, watching this beacon, or this AC2, whatever it is. My lieutenant, my Boktar, is here. My Monstriker is on this rooftop. The Rafiq and Mukhtar are in this and outside this building. And then there is the Kum Rider deploys here, being relatively confident that it will be fine. And then there is just a smattering of stuff throughout the midfield. So 1 Delami is here, another one is in this building alongside a Farzan, making itself kind of look like a Libertos. And then over here we have the actual Libertos with a mine inside this building, and then another Delami. So the shell game is in full effect. All of those things, if my opponent had been really paying attention to like how far forward stuff was, he probably would have gotten that one of them had to be a Libertos, one of them had to be something else. But they were kind of presenting that illusion. The Fidei is my reserve, and it will end up going down way over here. But let's go through Rob stuff. So here's the Whip 15 Lieutenant. which means that there's an interventor lieutenant. But an interventor lieutenant does not deploy during his initial deployment, which means he's keeping it back safe for days. This is a totally good play. I think it's the right thing to do, basically. If your opponent is playing Haqqislam, especially if they say, I have 2 reserves, but even if they don't, just reserve the lieutenant. You can reserve things to disincentivize for days or to punish for days. Like there is a puppet master with no puppets, but with with mind layer that he could have reserved dropped to fend off a Fidei. But if the Fidei just hard rolls down next to the impersonator, okay, you've killed the Fidei if it goes on you, but it's still giving you a tunnel lieutenant. And I think in this scenario that would be really bad. So what we have are hecklers and mines and hecklers. They're all over the midfield. They will jam me at various points, but it's not the end of the world. And then the bulk of everything is we have, back here, we have a motorized bounty hunter. We have a flash pulse remote, and then a missile bot hanging out back here. And then this space here is basically all taken up with a huge link team. So it's got Perseus, Hollowman Spitfire, Hollowman Missile Launcher, and 2 Stemplazons. So it's got 2 specialists, 2 TAC aware orders, 2 gunfighters, smoke, a melee expert. It's kind of the Uber link. The big disadvantage of it is that it is kind of the Uber link. You have to spend all, like, it can't be passive. It's not just like a big ARO piece. It's going to have to do things over the course of the game, and so the game is going to be sort of focused around it. There's also a clockmaker and a palbot, and that's basically it. So I will pop my Fidei down here. In the absence of anything else, I consider putting my Fidei down on the link team, but I ultimately decide not to do that, and that he's going to try and hack and guided missile. I'm going to go after the guided missile bot, and there's actually a really juicy Fidei point where it lands, where it can hit lots of things with templates. So I put it down there. That makes the roll, and then down comes the interventor, basically a long way away where it will be in no danger. So good, kind of like, you know, preventing risk from Rob there. Rob strips orders from my primary combat group, and away we go. So the first thing I do is to activate the Fidei and see what I can get. It moves into close combat with the missile bot to break its impersonation and threatens just a ton of shotguns. Actually, it idles, it maybe discovers in place, threads a bunch of shotguns. Everything dodges, and I lay down templates over everything, and I have hit with my boarding shotgun the missile bot, the Fanus in the back, the motorized bounty hunter in the back, and the engineer's helper bot. They're all surprised, they are all dodging, two of them are dodging with -3, and I kill the helper bot. Missile bot dodges into melee, and that's that. Okay, that kind of sucks. Could have been a really good kill, like series of kills. Actually, hypothetically, could have been like a game-winning amount of damage on the first order there, but no worries. Let's activate. All I have is an AP CCW because I paid for the crap today. But let's see if we can't kill this missile bot. I attack. He doesn't win the face-to-face roll, but he does pass his save, and then the Fanus dodges into CC. So at that point, we are looking like this. Both of Rob's remotes have fallen off of their thing, but we have an unconscious helper bot over here, and a Fidei engaged by 2 models with para CCWs. At this juncture, I basically decide that this is Rob's problem now, not mine. I am not going to spend... I could feasibly find my way out, right? So if the Fidei activates and idles, then one of the 2 remotes has to declare the attacker, and it will be burst 2, and I can then face-to-face it. But I would much rather just make my opponent spend those orders. This is his problem now. If he fires into melee, he could potentially kill both of those. So, cool. Okay, I'm just going to leave the Fidei there. So basically the bulk of the rest of this turn is doing scenario stuff, like aggressively doing scenario stuff. The goal is to get down a lot of pitches. There's a big missile launcher up here, and it's got kind of like this line of fire. It's pretty open, but I'm able to get the Monstrucker. Cautious moves down the side of the building, moves up to here, and pops down 1 scanner. So there's in this building here, there's one of the zones of the origin point of a zone of operations that I need to scan. So we get a multi-scanner down there. The Farzan starts out next to this multi-scanner, and she moves in this direction and pops down a scanner there. And again, specialist bonus means that they easily succeed. And then she comes out. There's a doorway here on this side of the building, and she pops out here, recamouflages, pops out, crawls forward, and she basically ends the turn. She places another scan. She places a scanner down here, which is in zone of operations of out here is Rob's zone, is Rob's deployment zone. Multi-scanner, so I get basically all of those down, which means I have 3 scanners in place. The Farzan is kind of exposed, but I have placed 3 scanners, which means I'm on a lot of points. I'm scoring 2 zones, and Rob's home zone, which in the scoring for this scenario is quite good, and that will set me up well in future. At this juncture, I really only have a few orders left, and a bunch of them are tack aware. This is one of the disadvantages of running a list that's like, ooh, lots of tack aware, is that if it's not all concentrated in one place, and in a given turn, some of it's going to be useless. So, for example, the Rafiq's tack aware order with the Mukhtar kind of just shuffles them around. The Shakutra's does go into suppressive fire, and I had deployed it basically expecting that it would go into suppressive fire to sort of like lock this angle down here. I'm not expecting it to do much, but it is used for the order. And a little more interestingly, we have the Boktai Lieutenant use the Lieutenant order to move around here, and then go into suppressive fire. And that's sort of one of the things I had hoped they would be able to do, where they can relocate and suppress if they're doing nothing else. Potentially 10 inches of movement, because the Boktar is an amazing dodger, so you can just roll for your dodge. And suppression with an MSV1, Mimetism, 2 wounding cap, viral weapon. That feels kind of tasty. So we do that, and then we have a few orders left, and so the Khum Rider just runs around here into melee with his motorized bounty hunter, and actually puts it down. This reveals to be a Heckler jammer, which tries to jam me twice, but either fails or I pass the BTS roll, and so I get a kill. I get the only kill of the turn on an 8-point motorized bounty hunter with a 7-point Khum Rider, but still, a kill's a kill. Thumbs up. So it's Rob's turn at this point, and he has to do a little bit of triage, despite the fact that I only, like, he's got almost full order bottle. He's operating with his Lieutenant order, 2 tack aware, and like everything bar the 1 motorized bounty hunter that I killed. But things are a little awkward, because he's running this big core link. So they're in, if you recall, they are in this position of the board here. They need to do a lot of things. The first thing he needs to do is he wants to get the Fidei for it. He wants to clean himself up from the Fidei. So the link team has to move in this direction, but there are a variety of Mimetism 0 camouflage markers on Overwatch. So we have to pause to deal with those. Now he's got sensor bots. He's very good sensor marksmanship bots, very good at discovering things, but it takes kind of like, 2 orders each time. And actually we have, for the purposes of testing, a bit of a rewind here, where, and this is what I talk about, this discombobulation. Rob has remembered, he's jotted down in his mind that there was a camo marker here and a Mimetism 0 here, and so he's gone Libertos, even though it's too far forward to be a Libertos. So when Perseus, as part of the link, moves in this direction, tempting what he thinks is a shotgun arrow, and it turns out to be a Panzerfaust arrow and Perseus evaporates, we just quietly wind that back, because it would close the game out pretty significantly. So we just kind of undo that. And so Rob spends this very long turn basically doing a few things. Where the link moves in this direction, and it clears off this Delamy here. And actually clears off one that's moved into this doorway. And then it yeets Perseus in this direction, into melee with the Fidei, where he is burst 3 plus his pistols. He's burst 4 in combat. He's not losing that face-to-face roll. He annihilates the Fidei, but then he has to get back around here, reform the link. And then we move in this direction, and then we take out this multi-scanner here that's scanning this zone. It's like we're running out of things to do. That's a lot of orders already, and other stuff has to be accomplished. Mission things have to be accomplished. So Meteor Zond turns up, walks on here, walks around to there, and we actually stop. There's a good little missile play here where the Meteor Zond, remember I got this multi-scanner here? Well, the Lieutenant uses its order to spotlight and missile the multi-scanner, which kills the multi-scanner but knocks the Monstrucker unconscious, which will be relevant next turn. Then the Meteor Zond is kind of stuck. It's kind of stuck there, and it takes about 3 orders because it's not a mission-relevant specialist. It takes 3 orders to place its multi-scanner, but it does. And then Rob kind of just like has enough orders left to set his link team up in this position here. So there's plenty of Overwatch again. Things are watching things, but he has spent volley after volley after volley putting down my multi-scanner. He hasn't even managed to kill my Farzan, which sort of like nooked its way back there at some point during this turn. So I still have the specialist that I wanted. All he's done is slow down the progress. I scored points off of those multi-scanners. He's killed them, I had to replace them, but it took him a lot more orders. One of the interesting things about this scenario in its draft that we played, it took him a lot more orders to kill them than it took me to place them, mostly due to bad dice. It should have been much easier, but it was very, very difficult. So we roll into my second turn, and I am in position basically to do quite a bit. I can reestablish my scoring, but first let's go to this Boktar. So the Boktar, you'll remember, had gotten into this position here and gone into suppression, but it still has 2 orders. I'm down a bunch of irregulars, by the way. Like, many Delamy have died at this juncture, but it's really just Delamy that have died. So the Bogdar comes out this way, and it long-range fires. It's got two free orders. Long-range fires a paramedic dart and revives the Monstrucker, then moves through this space here and then back down, and long-range fires a paramedic dart at the Dalami that's unconscious down here, but that one I failed. The Dalami's only phys 11, down it goes. But that was still like a pretty worthwhile use of about, really only about 3 orders that I had to spend to do that. The Shakush moves forward, and it takes an engagement with the Hollow Man, but it's a Shakush, and it's just kind of crap. And I don't know really why I keep taking these things. In many respects, like, okay, sure, it is BS 14, armor 6, and 3 structure, whereas like an Azrael is BS 13 and armor 5 and only 2 wounds, but you can doctor an Azrael very, very reliably, provided it hasn't gone all the way to dead. And the Azrael needs to land perishingly fewer shots to potentially kill a dedicated pace. I wanted to try the Shakush. It is very expensive for ultimately what is kind of just like a big heavy infantry. The probably should be using an AP Spitfire loadout, but I really prefer to play, even as Haqqislam, I much prefer to play at least one long-range gun. Sometimes you just get locked out of scenario if you don't have that. If you have a Fade that whiffs and you're playing on a crap table that's just field of fire everywhere, you need to have multiple plans to be able to progress up the board. And so if a Shakush is hogging your points in your SWC, it kind of has to be that plan, even though from a performance perspective, the AP Spitfire would have done so much better than the HMG did. Anyway, it kind of does nothing, and it will eventually die to the Hollow Man. The rest of this turn, though, we get to just sort of do irregular things. So remember, we've got the Libertos over here and the Dalami in this building. They go after, and they take some casualties. I think the Dalami dies, actually, but it is between the two of them, they put down the multi-scanner that Rob has laid over here and the Meteorzond. The Farzan jumps, recamouflages, runs back out this building, and then replaces that scanner there. And then the Monstrucker, who has been revived from unconscious, moves in this direction and leaves a scanner behind. So I have sort of rebuilt all of this infrastructure that Rob spent a lot of time destroying, and probably, I think, mistakenly, now that we played the scenario a bit, mistakenly spent time destroying. I think it's much more valuable to pursue your own scenario objectives first and kill your opponent's stuff second in this scenario. Just because something has a destructible profile doesn't mean you should destroy it. I think the kill over here was very clean, but going after this one here, for example, should have been a secondary order of business. But I kind of just rebuild everything. I am down a lot more irregulars. I have fewer left than I did before, but I'm all of the points are re-established. The Burids have done kind of nothing. The Shakush is faffing around. The Boktar actually ends up in this position back here, and at that point we roll into Rob's second turn. So in his second turn, this link is all still like kind of intact, but he has to do various things. There is like a Dalami that is like watching along this line, and there's a Dalami over here, and he has to more or less fight his way out, and he has to do so in a way that kind of breaks up some of the link. And this is, not to sort of cut a long story short, this is kind of like, if you think about where the status quo for this turn has ended, that is how things will continue for the rest of the game. Perseus has to like fight his way clear. The Link team breaks at a certain point. I'm able to get some shots into this building and take out one of I pick things apart. And over the course of the game, actually, the Boktar will eventually go on to be a significant hero. The Shakush is going to go down like a pile of dirt, but the Boktar will do some really useful work where it's able to, firstly, Perseus comes after it, and then it goes into the Hollow Man link. It's a surprisingly good piece for fighting Perseus. It's relatively tough, and it's got a viral weapon, and he's not shock immune, and it's MSV Mimetism, so his MSV minus 6 is not super useful. And that's one of the things I was kind of hoping to test for the Boktar, was it does, as expensive as it is, and it is expensive, it's got equipment that kind of means it's always useful. Mimetism 3 MSV1 is one of those loadouts that will always give you some kind of an edge, or at bare minimum equalize a bad fight. And it just fought Perseus for like 4 orders before taking a wound eventually and sort of ducking back. But all of this old school, or early N4 Haqqislam area denial, where there's no Matalia, it's all just there's not even any bikers. One of them died almost immediately to a on Rob's first turn to a linked Spitfire. But it's just Dalami. It's just Dalami inflicting a few casualties, taking a bit too long to die, and then this random Boktar lieutenant doing a whole bunch of work. So we play through and we end up in a situation where we kind of just sort of broadly call it after the bottom of round 2, a bit of back and forth fighting. We play a bit of my round 3 where I sort of have to suicide a few pieces forward. I have hemorrhaged many, many troops, many, many orders, but I've done so in a way that has carried me through to a near maximum scenario score. So at this juncture, Rob can like annihilate almost my entire army, but he's lost troops as well, and he just hasn't been able to recover the scenario lead. He hasn't been able to get his own scanners down, and when he has, I've destroyed them. And so his last turn is basically an effort with his few remaining specialists to get to my objective and take it down. And at this point, the Shakush redeems itself. The Shakush has been unconscious for some time at this juncture, but I have one order spare on my last turn, and so I've crawled out the pilot. And the pilot standing there with its shotgun holds up like half of everything Rob tries to do with his turn and basically doesn't die. So turns out the Shakush, that's one significant edge, to be fair, that the Shakush has over the Azrael, in that if it goes to unconscious and you can't recover it, well, it has a random dude with a shotgun who is a specialist who can crawl out and do something. But otherwise, we basically, we wargame out, I'm aware of the irony, a bunch of the last turn. We make some, basically then spend about half an hour talking about the scenario and changes and things that work, etc. And we call that an evening. Really enjoyed the scenario, really enjoyed the matchup, really enjoyed experimenting with some things in Haqqislam. I'm not going to play the Shakush that much again, at least for the medium term, but I want to give the Boktar a bit more time. I've been finding with Haqqislam lists that you can about afford one vanity piece. You can get a mix of stuff, like you have varied Haqqislam lists. You have to decide how your irregulars are allocated, whether you have Bikers or Dalami and Libertos and Matalia, there's too many to take tons of. What's your mix going to be? You can accommodate maybe 4 or 5. So there's tons of variation in Haqqislam there, and your your cheaper pieces, your sort of 14 to 15 point pieces are quite varied and useful. And then you get your core kind of gunfighting, your duos, your other stuff, and there's just about space at the end of all of that. All of those good but variable elements to have one vanity piece. I have some lists that have been using a Sundukbud, and I have been enjoying those. And I am going to continue to try out the Boktar. I don't know if it will make its way in permanently. In particular, I want to play it without a Farzan chain of command and see if that really scuppers me. It is running a risk. It is something that you're kind of forcing those 50 points to be used later in the game, and hoping that you don't just get oblivioned at some point in the early game. But yeah, I think this is something that is interesting. It's something that I want to try. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about it, and I'll see you next time.